Recording in progress.
Hi everyone, my name is Lyba. I'm recording this workshop for the AWGMDC 2025. It's a very basic workshop on how you should try to prep for a motion and how you can make the most of your prep time, generally what the approach should be for motions. This workshop is going to be for 30 minutes, and I know that we don't have 30 minutes for prep, but the aim is going to be to try to just teach you what you can do in the limited amount of prep time you have, and then you can practice that within your prep time or just practice anyway. So, some of you might already be familiar with this. There's four things we need to do when we're looking at how to prep for a motion. The first is we need to define the topic. Obviously, there's a few things in the motion we need to make clear. Second, we need to know what our burden is in the debate. So, what is it that we need to be able to achieve at the end of the day? Third, we need to do framing and characterization. So, we'll explain this when we get to that. And fourth, we need to obviously make arguments for both sides or for, in case of BP, potentially also foresee what our closing is going to do or our opening is going to do, and so on. So the motion we're going to be practicing with is as follows. So today's motion is this House believes that governments should prioritize supply side solutions over demand side and redistributive solutions to address housing crises in major cities. We have an info slide for this, which reads, in many major cities, housing costs have risen rapidly due to population growth, urbanization, and limited new developments. Economists broadly agree that two leading strategies can reduce housing costs. Supply side solutions aim to increase the total number of housing units, primarily through zoning reform, easing building restrictions, and incentivizing private development. On the other side, the demand side and redistributive solutions aim to help individuals afford housing through government interventions such as rent control, public/social housing, rental subsidies, or taxes on vacant homes. While both approaches can coexist, governments often have limited resources and must prioritize one approach in both funding and political capital. So, from reading the motion, we already know a few things, right? So, we know that this is going to be a trade-off. One of like the opposition cannot, in this case, say that we will do a little bit of both. Clearly, the info slide is telling us that no, that's not the case. You need to pick one because you have limited funding, you have limited political capital. And they have given us a good idea of what we mean by both types of solutions so that the debate is going to be clear for us. So, as we discussed, the first step is to define the motion and underline or circle key terms in the motion. We need to do this every time, especially when you start prepping. And if it's new to you, like if debating is new to you, you should definitely do this. After a while, I think it starts becoming a bit more intuitive what the key terms are and what really the motion is demanding from you. So I've already underlined some of the key terms, as you guys can notice. We already know what governments means, so we don't need to define that. We also know that supply side and demand side have been covered in the info slide, so we don't need to define that either. We also noticed that the info slide already talked about how this is a trade-off, so the prioritized part of the debate is already something that we also understand. But we know that the motion and the info slide doesn't really mention what major cities are. And this is a bit vague at this stage. So what we need to do is we need to start by thinking about examples of what is a major city. And we need to come up with multiple types of examples from all across the world, from developed countries, from developing countries. We need to think of what this is going to include. So as you can see, I've included a few examples here. I've added New York, LA, London, New Delhi, Mumbai, Karachi, Lahore, Seoul, Jakarta, Dhaka, etc. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of examples that we can start thinking about, and then we can actually start characterizing this debate. So, what can we do in terms of characterization? We need to ask ourselves a few questions. This is how I like to go about it because I think that um, the first step is you can sometimes think about examples, even when it comes to the housing crisis. You can think about examples, but you need to think about why certain things are happening. What is the logical reasoning for that? And for example, one of the questions we can ask when it comes to the major cities is that what do these major cities look like? What is common among these major cities? So maybe there's like what makes them so different from just any regular city within the same country? There's something that's unique, and there's something unique about them, unique about the major cities within the developing worlds. Maybe there's something unique about all the major cities in the developed world. So we need to be a bit careful and think about what commonalities exist between them. And we need to start listing those down so that we can include that in our characterization. And this is going to be useful for us when we get to the stage later where we are going to talk about our arguments and how to make them relevant. So our characterization is going to be quite important there. Another question, for example, we can ask about the housing crisis is what does the housing crisis look like in these cities? So these are major metropolitan cities. What's unique about the housing crisis there? How does it manifest there? So I've already added some information about answering these questions. So the first is we know that major cities are very, very overpopulated. And if you notice, a lot of what I'm doing here is I'm asking leading questions in my characterization because I need to paint a picture of what does the housing crisis look like? What do the major cities look like? So I ask a lot of leading questions to be able to build that characterization. So I know that they're overpopulated. I know that there's possibly a lot of rural urban migration taking place. Sometimes it's not just rural urban migration taking place, it's also like cross-border migration taking place. That if there are migrants coming into your country from another country, they're potentially also moving into major cities only and perhaps not moving into smaller towns. There must be a reason for that. Why is it that I need to think about, okay, why is it that people come to these cities in specific? Perhaps because the services there are better compared to the rural areas or the smaller towns. Possibly the job opportunities are better. The ethnic like makeup of these cities is a bit more diverse. So that's where we answer what the demographics look like. So potentially maybe the ethnic makeup of New York looks very diverse. There's people from all sorts of ethnicities and cultures. And sure, maybe that's one of the reasons for why people move in. And that's also just an outcome of people moving in. So it can go both ways. And we also know that states often spend a lot of time and money on infrastructure, on making these business hubs. They're often perhaps even cities that historically were just places of trade, and so that just continued. Maybe there's very specific landmarks that exist there. So we know that there's just a lot when it comes to major cities. We also know that one of the common problems in major cities is gentrification. So I've I've gotten a good picture of what's actually going on within these cities. Then let's look at what the housing crisis looks like within these areas. So obviously we know that this means there's rising housing prices. So whether you want to live in a home or you want to rent an apartment, in either case, it's really expensive. We also know that potentially most of the people within the cities are looking to rent an apartment and not perhaps live in a home because majority of individuals might possibly be individuals that are just single or maybe students or maybe just especially younger workers, they just perhaps are trying to live alone. But this could be disputed based on how you characterize or where you characterize the debate. We also note that the not only is the rent high, there is also just poor quality of housing. Maybe the housing is just not repaired. It's quite damaged. The access to infrastructure is perhaps not as good. It's quite cramped. Sometimes the housing is just not available or is not available to your workplace. It's not nearby. There's a lot of slums, so potentially there are people moving in to the city, perhaps because of rural urban migration, and they're unable to find a place to live, and that's going to lead to maybe slums. Maybe this is also causing a lot of homelessness. So maybe people were fine, and then for some reason or the other became homeless, and they're unable to find a place to live. There might also just be too many people living in one area. So there might be zones within the city where there is specifically overcrowding happening. So maybe there will be posh neighborhoods within the same city, and then there will be neighborhoods which are just extremely overcrowded, and the resources in that area are also overcrowded. And then we also know that the rent is rising really, really fast, but the wages are not rising as fast. And maybe the wages are still quite high compared to other cities in the same country, but we know that it's still not enough to help the people out in terms of the rent still taking a significant portion of their income. Um, the last step within this characterization is that now that we've asked a lot of questions to paint a picture about the vague parts of the motion, and again, we need to have a really clear picture in our mind. We need to really imagine that, okay, if I was in a major city, what would I notice about the housing crisis? What would I notice about the city itself? What's really unique? Like, I have to imagine all of that through these questions. But what I also need to do is I also need to think about what kind of stakeholders are affected by this. And I really need to have a good picture of that as well. So I know that multiple types of people will be affected by this. I know most intuitively, this is poor everyday workers. This is the working class people. This is also affecting middle class people. This is also potentially affecting minorities, potentially also ethnic groups. Potentially people are living in different zones based off of what culture or ethnic group they belong to. So I know that maybe specific parts of the city only African Americans are living in, maybe specific parts of the city only white people are living in, so on and so forth. So I know that this is also something that these are also the kind of stakeholders that I need to consider in this debate. Um, and so I need to start thinking about what kind of stakeholders are affected overall, but which ones are potentially the most important for me. So that I know that this is the stakeholder that I would have to frame the debate around. We'll get into that when I move to the next slide. Okay, so the next step that we should have is we need to think about what our burden is within this debate. Now, obviously, your first step is before you start thinking about the opening and closing, you need to be clear on what your burden is, just as side government or side opposition. We know that both teams are trying to fix the housing crisis, but one side seems to be arguing for less intervention, is perhaps trying to encourage the market to fix itself on its own, which is the proposition. And then the other side is being a bit more drastic. It's intervening a lot more into the market. And we need to be able to design the burden, we need to be able to foresee what the main clash is. So obviously the main clash here is, should governments expand the pie, which is build more houses, or cut the pie differently and help people afford or retain access to the limited stock of housing that is available. So we know that this is the main clash that both teams will be disagreeing on. And now, because of this, we know that there are certain things that we need to do to win this debate. Notice that because of this difference in what we need to achieve at the end of the day, we will be prioritizing a different type of stakeholder. So prop is obviously benefiting landowners, property owners, private development companies. It's also potentially prioritizing the middle class, because obviously it's to some extent agreeing that people would be able to afford housing, while the opposition is going to be focusing more on things like rent control, so on and so forth, and focusing on working class people, homeless people, poor people, who, despite how many homes you might be able to come up with, are not going to be able to afford that housing. So you need to notice when you're thinking about your burden and your clash that it's catering to a specific type of stakeholder. And that's why your framing needs to be relevant to that stakeholder, and your framing and characterization of that stakeholder is going to actually help you in this debate. debate. So this is when we can actually start moving to now the framing of this debate. Okay, so we know that in order to win at proposition, we need to show that it's more efficient to just have more houses in number compared to cutting the pie differently. And when we're thinking about the framing, we need to consider what kind of a context is actually going to make our impacts, our benefits and harms the most relevant or significant for the judge. So for assigned government, we know that we need to frame the problem very differently. So if I'm focusing on how the main stakeholder I want to benefit is middle class families, I need to be careful on how I convince the judge that this is the most important stakeholder. So what I might do is a few things. I might first say that, look, there's lots of different types of people that live within the city. Yes, there's poor people, there's wealthy people, there's middle class people. Poor people are potentially a small minority of people living within the city because they're poor. They clearly, they're just like the kind of people that move into the city often have the financial ability to afford living within the city. And so most of the times you make that really difficult financial decision to move into the city because you actually get a good job or you've gotten a job that's just letting you get by. And because leaving your home is quite difficult, like if you're coming from a nearby city, leaving your home and your comfort and things that you are okay with is a very difficult emotional and financial decision. The kind of people that actually make this step are people that do have some level of financial capability. And notice that these are often major business hubs where a lot of industrial work, a lot of even economic activities taking place. So maybe a large chunk of the population here is actually middle class or high middle class or low middle class, and the wealthy and the poor are maybe on the extreme ends of the spectrum. So I might try to frame it like that, and I might say, because of this, the most important and relevant stakeholder in this debate is the middle class that we need to cater to. And so, Judge, we think that um, opposition's policy is useless because they don't really tackle the stakeholder because this is the most people in number within the city. So that way, I might be able to frame my debate as more relevant to this specific stakeholder because I'm now given reasons as to why that specific stakeholder is the more important one. Why is that the one that exists more in number within the city, or why I need to cater to that? Similarly, an opposition, because I'm trying to focus on the poor people and the working class people, I might try to frame this debate a bit differently. So I might say that I disagree with proposition's framing. I think that the most number of people that exist within the city are not the middle class people. Middle class people often live in suburbs. They can also live in smaller towns. But the kind of people that live within the city, the majority of them are potentially just working class people because they move there because there's major industries. So major production facilities exist often within the city. And there is just a huge demand for labor in the factories, in potentially like you need, for example, security guards, you need like people that are taxi drivers, you need like people that are just, doing work in grocery stores, they're cashiers. So there is just a huge, like the most significant demand of labor for daily workers perhaps exists within the city, which is why most people that move into the city are often moving there for these kinds of jobs. And I might say that this is also a reason why often the cross-border immigration becomes relevant because sometimes people move and this is the only kind of job they find and so on and so forth. So I might say that, okay, maybe this is the kind of actual labor that exists. I might also say that actually because cities are increasingly like really overpopulated. The middle class and the rich are just a significant portion, but most amount of people that have moved into the cities are people that have just moved there for a better life, and now they've realized that, well, what they thought about the city, that was just a rosy picture, and Now they've lost everything. And so there's a huge chunk of people, and even with immigration, we can make it relevant that people come and maybe they're escaping from a war zone or whatever the reason they're there for. They just don't have anything. And often these are the people are employed in very, very basic jobs or they're just really poor. So I might say that actually a huge chunk of the city is just working class people or poor people and not middle class or rich people, as they could also potentially afford to live outside the city or live a bit further from the city because they can drive and come to work and so on and so forth. So if you notice, this is quite interesting. Both sides can frame the debate according to what they think is important, and framing can go either way. It's just how many reasons you can convince the judge as to why your framing is more important. I might even say that because, especially for closings, if I feel like um, my one of my the opening team on my bench is only focusing on, let's say, developed countries, and they're sort of going on about how the kind of people that move into the cities, they're often rich people, and they gentrify the neighborhood. I might disagree with that and say that that's not very accurate, especially for the developing world, where most of the people that will move into the cities might be students, might be day laborers. Like that's why those people often leave their villages and come into the city. So again, if you think about it, there's so many interesting ways to actually frame the debate. You can think about it along the lines of developing versus developed. You can think about commonalities. You can think about major areas and zones, and that gives you lots of different types of ideas. Again, on opposition, I would argue that the trend we see in the developing world is that most people are that move into the city are often like huge chunks of their population are just they're working class people. The reason you don't think that there's a significant number of them is because often they're living in specific areas within the city that are just designated to be low income neighborhoods. And so if you as a middle class person have just never been to those neighborhoods, you wouldn't know how concentrated those are. But often population is quite concentrated there. Anyway, we're just going off a tangent here. The point is, framing can be really interesting when you think about it, and when you think about how you can make your impacts more relevant. I'm not even thinking about my impacts. I'm just thinking about relevant stakeholders and trying to make my framing relevant to that so that I can just make really good arguments later on. Um, and lastly, what you should also consider when you're thinking about your framing is that there are some things that you will ultimately have to concede, but you should be fine with that. And you should ideally frame your debate as such that even with the concession, you paint your side as just achieving. Um, a lot of impacts and basically minimizing your framing can also minimize the harm that the other team is trying to talk about. So for example, we know that proposition strategy is going to be about like they could potentially mention that even if you build social housing, it's still not going to be enough to cater to people. So for example, if I was opening government in this debate, I would just say within the start that I know that the opposition is going to talk about social housing, but I feel like we need to clarify that because the most number of people within a major city often tend to be from middle class or middle income households because of these XY reasons we were just discussing before, I don't think that they're going to be able to cater to the majority of people within the major cities. So yes, even in their best case scenario, they cater to some people which are poor, but they're not catering to the most number of people. And then I might say their policies unsustainable, expensive, so on and so forth, other mitigatory stuff. But you need to think about some of this stuff in your prep as well. That why is your stakeholder more important? And this is also why your framing becomes more important later when you link it with arguments and you start weighing, because you say that, look, we're catering to the most number of people. This is the most important stakeholder because maybe this is the most vulnerable, or maybe the most long lasting change is achievable, whatever. But you need to understand that you will concede that opposition will be able to potentially achieve maybe some quality of housing for uh, poor working class people. But even then, we can show that our benefit is just much better. Similarly, the opposition might say, Well, even if you build more housing, because we think that the most number of people within a city are just poor people, they're just never going to be able to afford it. And this problem is going to continue existing. Okay, so this is just a really basic, like, idea of how you can think about your framing. And again, like I said, especially if you're closing, I would suggest thinking a lot about the different ways in which you can play around with this debate. Because for me, in closing, I would really think about how I can think about, like, the developed world or the developing world. What's other stuff that I can make relevant? So think about that very carefully. Okay, now let's move on to discussing the intuitive arguments and impacts. So I've listed down a bunch of arguments for us over here. If you tend to struggle with coming up with arguments, there is a tip that I do have for you. So first, I would suggest to just come up with as many arguments as possible, as many intuitive arguments. And especially, I understand that at closing, you might want to be good at just generating a lot of content, because again, your opening might be thinking of the same content. One tip I have for that is that I usually at closing make a very extensive list of stakeholders, and I try to see if there's potentially something that my opening is going to miss, and then I think of all possible arguments related to those kinds of stakeholders that I have come up with. So that's potentially a tip that you could try if you're closing. But let's kind of go over the arguments that we have so far as to overall what we think the government is going to argue. So we know that the government is going to say that the problem is that people do have money, but land is not available due to zoning restrictions. Um, Zoning restrictions are often at times favoring single families. There might be environmental controls. There might be other reasons, like some land might have been allotted for industrial development, and so it's not being made into a residential scheme. So potentially people did have some money, but because zoning laws are quite strict and the government is just quite strict about what can be developed where, they might be not able to afford that, or maybe the person doesn't really need a really huge, like maybe it's just one person that has to live. They don't need an entire apartment. They just need a very small room. And so zoning laws also restrict how big the room should be, how much the height should be, how much the width should be, what kind of stuff should be available. So maybe I just don't need all of that, and I want to live in a much smaller place, and I'm more comfortable paying less for that. So the proposition might argue that these are things that we then deal with on our side of the house, because even if you have the housing and all that, it's just not catering to people that potentially have the ability to pay, but are just not being able to access housing. And again, if you have more housing, the rent will also go down because people have more options available. This is just fair to both renters as well as landowners, the tenants as well as the people renting their apartment. It also like incentivizing private development can lead to much better housing being developed within a budget. Like I said, it ensures that you have, if somebody wants to opt for a better type of housing, they have that option available. If they want to live in a very basic type of housing, they have that option available. But obviously with on a comparative, when we talk about the government or social housing, that's obviously going to be the very, very bare minimum and only accessible by specific types of people. Um, Opposition's policy only caters to a small minority of people. It's not a long-term solution. How much social housing can the government even guarantee? Like, it's only going to be catering to poor people. And even if the government is giving them housing, it's not dealing with why perhaps they are in the cycle of poverty to begin with. So maybe the number of poor people will just um, continue to increase because living within the city will just continue becoming unbearable, and the governments will continuously have to provide more and more and more, but they don't really fix the root cause, which might be other reasons for why poverty is happening. And potentially, maybe that's where they should be looking and letting the markets do more private development. Issues with zoning, environmental reasons, we've already discussed this. We might say that um, We might also say that again, like we discussed, we can say we cater to the most number of people. Poor people don't just need social housing, but other stuff as well. So governments should focus on the other stuff, which is maybe employment opportunities, so on and so forth. We might also say that, again, it's really expensive to continuously provide social housing. And there's lots of boxes you have to like tick before you actually get the housing, social housing. So you need to meet a specific criteria for that. Um, People also might be living on the outskirts or far. More private developments of land might also be good in creating jobs, construction work, grocery stores. So in terms of economic development, this is a good thing. There's also people that potentially might afford being able to live on the outskirts, but maybe the land is not developed, or maybe the government has not developed the infrastructure. The more private development there is, government is also incentivized to build infrastructure for that. Again, which creates jobs. More options available for people who are not single family renters. We discussed this. And quality of housing can also be maintained. And then we can talk about how policies like rent control subsidies lead to poor housing because landowners just might not have an incentive to improve the housing. If there's rent control, they might not do damage repairs, which means that the quality of housing is also going to go down. And so you're still paying significant chunk, but it's not as improved now. And then we could also talk about how landowners might choose to have longer leases and stuff because, again, if there's rent control, they might just be like, okay, let's just have a longer lease. And then they're not fixing the apartment either. So these are a couple of ideas that we can have for the government side. And then for opposition, I have a couple of ideas as well. So for this, at opposition, we talk about how the problem is not how many houses exist, but rather some people not being able to afford it at all. We can talk about here how people's right to live in a home is just a lot more important than whatever private development companies' right is to make profit or not be interfered with. We can talk about how poverty is generally on the rise. We can give systemic reasons for that. We can talk about how people are misguided. They come to slums, and the competitive business landscape of cities also just demands that some people lose out, and that's why there might be a lot more poverty within the cities as opposed to on the other cities or smaller towns. We can talk about how housing is a right. The ones to help are the poorest of the poor. Other people can still live in the suburbs. So again, very interesting because we can show here that middle class people or higher middle class people can still afford to live slightly further away from their jobs and that they might still be able to afford something. They can still make their ends meet in somewhere way. Like we can even talk about how, for example, their jobs might have inflation adjusted pay because the kind of jobs they might be would be white collar jobs. But for really, really poor people, because they are just day laborers, their pays are not often inflation adjusted and often stay really low. And so they're the ones we need to cater to. We can also talk about how it's just unsustainable. Like how many houses can the government even incentivize, like private development? If that's happening, how many houses can you build? Because the land is also very restricted in terms of what you have access to. Like maybe there's like a riverbed or just national forest area, like how much are you going to, what's the lengths that you're going to go to just keep building housing? And we can talk about how private development is a completely different incentive because private development, the reason that obviously someone would choose to get involved in this business is so that they could make lots of money. Obviously, the profit is the main incentive. So obviously, they're going to be trying to cater to the rich, wealthy people. And so they'd be making condos, they'd be making, again, like really unnecessary services might be offered that's just not relevant for someone who is working class. And we can talk about how this also makes gentrification worse because potentially what these companies might be doing is developing like a really nice condo and then people are just doing Airbnb within them. Maybe they're renting to tourists. And then that's just making gentrification worse because again, a lot of tourists might move in because of that. Again, the rent is still going up. Similarly, the gentrification is also getting like really bad because again, they are moving into neighborhoods and then developing lots of property that's just really high end, and that's increasing rents in even like areas that where the rent was potentially starting really low, and that's pushing a lot of poor people out from those areas. We can give reasons for why potentially, for this argument, we need to give reasons for why they would have an incentive to move into these areas where the rent is low, because again, they buy land for cheap and then they convert it into a much better area, and that's the profit motive for them. We can talk about how uh, the lack of housing just uniquely impacts low income people. So maybe stuff like for like again, you are more susceptible to harassment, to crime, stuff like that. So as a poor person, your ability to seek recourse and justice is also very limited, as opposed to a middle class person might choose to move to a different city if they don't get housing within the city. Maybe they might look for a different job, they might move to their hometown, whatever. So they still have options available in terms of even their worst case scenario, but for a low income person, even moving to a different city would be very difficult. And so that means they're often just sleeping on the street, and then are going to be more susceptible to things like crime. We can also, on opposition side, talk about environmental harms. We might talk about cramped housing. We might talk about how, in fact, if we are removing zoning laws, that might lead to extremely terrible housing to begin with, where people are just cramped inside one room. And also, we could potentially argue that this entire thing also encourages people to keep moving into the city, which does more overcrowding and leads to more rent going up. So if you see, there are just so many things that you could argue, and potentially some of these are intuitive, some of these are not intuitive, but your aim should be to flesh out all of them and then circle what the most important ones are. What you should also be doing then, because I understand that if you have really strong openings, the openings would also be able to pick up on what are the most strongest ones. So that is going to become a really big problem when you're closing and you need to come up with ideas. But I'll just give you an example of how potentially you could sidestep that. One was, we need to, in order to come up with so many ideas, we need to make a really good extensive list of stakeholders, the who's in the city, who is affected by this, so on and so forth. But secondly, let's assume that our opening opposition in this debate just consistently talks about poor people and so on and so forth, and they just completely miss out on the environmental impacts. You can still make that quite relevant to the debate, again, based on how you frame the debate. For example, I might say that panel, actually, there is another common thing about major cities. They're often located right next to water bodies. They're often located right next to some really important landscape, and then you can give reasons, like the reasoning for this is because often the really important major cities are cities that were, or at least the majority of them, are cities that were historically natively just formed there. Like they were not artificially created, they were genuinely just places that humans intuitively just gathered near. And often the reasoning for this is because humans tend to gather near water bodies. So we think that majority of these cities are often cities that are in near rivers, near lakes, near the ocean, and if it's not water bodies, it's still really near some sort of natural forest, some mountain landscape. And again, the point is that they get their sustenance from there. Like they're, for example, even with the mountains, it's like a valley where the most major city will be. And notice I want to keep the focus on major cities, not just any city. So I would say that because of this, there's something really important we need to consider. We need to talk about how that's why a lot of the times there's really important restrictions on zoning laws and environmental laws, which are restricting what kind of development can happen there. And so this side, like the government side, is going to be removing all of that. And that's really dangerous because we've already seen that climate change is making things really difficult, and it's going to get worse, and a lot of cities are in fact sinking. For example, you could talk about Miami, and you could talk about how the water levels have gone up, and that's actually been forcing the Miami government to try to increase the city's level as well, so that they don't drown, which is a huge and significant problem. So we could use that example, and we could talk about how this is actually really dangerous because even in their best case scenario, they're able to develop lots of housing. But look at the kind of land that they would be developing this housing on. It would be near riverbeds, near water bodies, near the ocean, where this housing is going to be susceptible to flooding, to hurricanes, to natural disasters. Even if we consider mountains, again, like ice is melting, that means potentially more landsliding, more avalanche, so on and so forth. So there are, I know that they're trying to create more housing options for people, but they're literally having people pay to live in dangerous areas where potentially they don't even get really good insurance for their houses. And secondly, these are poor people that already have really difficult lives, and we're forcing them to live in areas where ultimately in the next year or 2 years or even 3 years later, they might either get killed by those natural disasters or just lose their home entirely. So again, even if it doesn't seem like at first glance the most important being really impact, you can make it really impactful for the debate based off of how you frame it. And then it can be really fun because you can say that, look, my argument actually caters to what, like, even the best case scenario that the government would have, which is that people get housing. Still, I have a problem because this is going to be what's going to happen to them. So yeah, we can do that, and I think that can be really fun to explore at closing. How you want to frame the debate, what kind of argument you think your government is going to be intuitively able to cover, what they're not going to be able to cover, and then just flesh out the impacts of that, and then weigh it. Again, just to recap on the weighing, there's just a couple of quick ways you can weigh your argument. You can talk about intuitively that you help the most number of people. You can talk about how you help the most vulnerable people. You can talk about how you help them in the most in-depth way possible, in the most meaningful way. So, for example, for the meaningful way, we often discuss that there's in-kind aid versus cash grants. In this debate as well, this can be something interesting to explore. We could talk about how maybe it's a long-term benefit versus a short-term benefit. Both can be really good. We could talk about how one is in one case there is certainty of harm versus probability of benefit. And then I think we could also potentially talk about how one is potentially an irreversible harm versus perhaps, like your harm is irreversible, it can never be. And then versus our benefit is a bit more flexible or something like that. So there's lots of things you can do. But again, when you're prepping, you need to think really carefully about framing. And that's why I spend a lot of time analyzing that with these arguments as well, so that you can see what actually you need to do to be able to kind of swing the debate in your favor, even if your opening is talking about a lot of things. And just lastly, again, a few more tips. A lot of the times I see this pattern, or this is just something I keep in mind when when I'm closing and I'm trying to figure out how I can generate more content and then frame it, just like the example I gave right now. Always useful to think about developing countries. Sometimes in the debate, everyone by default assumes that the examples have to be of developed countries, and they will consistently talk about the US or maybe just Western countries. Really useful to sometimes really think about, okay, where is this debate taking place? And if it is including a large chunk of the third world, then how can I use that to my benefit at closing? We can analyze and make arguments uniquely in those countries and those cultures. Don't limit it to one area. Again, like I said, you have to think about what's the commonality, but it's a very interesting way to think about things at closing. Think about specific cities. So, for example, in this debate, I really spent a lot of time, even when preparing for this, thinking about enclaves. Like, okay, so enclaves, how would they be affected? Is this going to destroy maybe enclaves? Maybe the culture within the city is going to be completely destroyed because of private development. That often tends to happen, right? Because again, you could make a really interesting argument about how within the city, like there's different cultural hubs, and now when you're allowing private development to intervene, they might potentially take advantage of people that are immigrants and force them to take those kind of deals and then convert that specific area into just a very gentrified neighborhood. And that's not good because often within these enclaves is where you also have more affordable food and so on and so forth, and a network and a strong community and so on. So, how would this affect the kind of people that live in the city? What kind of people then later move into the city? How would this affect the politics? So, the kind of people that vote within the city, how would this affect that? So, there are so many ways to explore that. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of those arguments, but I'm just giving you an example that when you're thinking about things, just try to break it down further, and sometimes it can give you really good ideas. Again, make a list of stakeholders. The way I make my lists are very extensive, so I won't just be like working class people. Like there's degrees, different types of people within working class as well. There's people that have different, but they have a specific type of job within working class, which might have slightly more mobility. One might not have that much mobility. There will be people that already have housing. There will be people that don't have housing. Then there will be obviously different race, ethnicities, genders. Then even within middle class, non-families, wealthy families, real estate investors, renters, homeowners, government, students, tourists, Airbnb, etc. So you should really make a huge list of stakeholders, especially when you're closing, to think carefully about how you're framing your impacts. They can all tie together. Yes, so that's about it for how you should approach this. Just to recap, again, you should really start off with defining, then characterizing your character, and then after that your that should give you a good idea of how you need to frame the debate in line with your burden. You need to then be able to come up with the most arguments as you can, and then flag which ones are the most important for you. Again, at opening government, it's not necessary that you run all arguments, though sometimes that might be a strategy, but it makes more sense to run the most important ones in opening governments and flesh them out compared to running too many and not having fleshed them out. And then at closings, like I said, your government might miss out some arguments, and it's really easy for you, based on how you frame those arguments, to actually make the judge really think about the impact that you have achieved in this debate. And these were just some tips for the closings as well. So I hope that this workshop has been useful for you all. And in case there are any questions, I guess you guys can leave it on the YouTube where this is going to be posted, or just message the Chief Adjudication panel. And good luck to everyone for the tournaments. And we can end the workshop now.